What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Gary Antuanne Russell, 15 wins and 0 losses, taking on Rances Barthelemy, 29 wins, 1 loss, 1 draw, and 1 no contest. You know, at first when this fight was announced, I was a little bit surprised that Rances Barthelemy was kind of listed as the B-side. And I guess it makes sense because Gary Antuanne Russell, the younger brother of Gary Russell Jr., from the ultra-talented Russell family. They've got several brothers who are boxing professionally. And rest in peace to Gary Russell Sr., the patriarch of the Russell family, recently passed away. But Gary Antuanne Russell is this new, young, exciting Russell brother. Again, Gary Russell Jr., former, longtime WBC featherweight champion, is his older brother, who I've long thought had some of the fastest hands in all of boxing. Gary Antuanne Russell is up and coming, and the rise has happened pretty suddenly, where he went from fighting pretty much under the radar, fought 5 times in 2019, the last of which was a very impressive second round TKO over Juan Huertas. And then he fought one more time in February of 2020, just before the COVID pandemic shut down boxing for several months. And that fight took place against Jose Marufo, which resulted in a first round knockout for Gary Antuanne Russell. So at this point, he's 13-0, fought that one time in 2020 after again fighting 5 times in 2019. And to this day, he's 15-0 with all of his fights resulting in a knockout. So he's got that Virgil Ortiz Jr. thing going where all of his fights have been wins via knockout. So then he takes the rest of the 2020 off. He doesn't get back into the ring until May of 2021, and that was against Giovanni Santiago. Giovanni Santiago was the guy who Adrian Broner last fought, was a big favorite against, and then was awarded a controversial decision win. Most people who watched Broner versus Santiago thought that Santiago deserved a close decision win. Broner was looking very uninspired in that fight. Granted, he had been out of the ring for a long time, but Santiago, in that loss, kind of built his name a little bit to where he gets this opportunity against this, again, rising talent in Gary Antuanne Russell, and Gary Antuanne Russell basically won just about every round en route to a 6-round stoppage over Santiago. So now Russell is beating people who people are at least familiar with. So you see this kind of rise where the opponent quality is starting to elevate with the notoriety of the fighter. So then after that win, stoppage win over Giovanni Santiago in May of 2021, Gary Antuanne Russell gets a big opportunity against former 140-pound champion Viktor Postol, whose only losses at that point were against Terrence Crawford via unanimous decision. There's still yet to be anybody at 147 who's taken Terrence Crawford the distance. But yeah, this was at this point Terrence Crawford's biggest challenge and then win against Viktor Postol. So Postol, by the time he fought Gary Antuanne Russell, had only lost against Terrence Crawford. Then he lost against Josh Taylor in a very close and competitive fight, lost via unanimous decision, and then lost a majority decision against Jose Ramirez, who we saw fight that battle for undisputed against the Tartan Tornado, Josh Taylor. So Viktor Postol has been seen as elite and then near elite as he got into his mid, then late 30s, and is 38 years old when he entered the ring against Gary Antuanne Russell. And Gary Antuanne Russell put on an excellent performance against the former champion, not only winning majority of the rounds, almost all of the rounds, like he had taken over on the scorecards, and then he stopped Viktor Postol in the 10th and final round. So he became the first to stop Viktor Postol. And granted, the fight didn't have to be called. I mean, Viktor Postol was starting to take a beating towards the later rounds of that fight, but this was one of those where it's just up to the ref's discretion to call the fight off. So, you know, there was a little bit, I wouldn't call it controversy, but it was a questionable stoppage. But again, it's within the referee's discretion to make that call. So Gary Antuanne Russell has his career best win against a former champion in the division. He's looking spectacular, very impressive. He doesn't have the same hand speed as brother Gary Russell Jr., but he is a stronger fighter, it seems. It seems like he's got a little bit more pop. I mean, even though Gary Russell Jr. did knock out Johnny Gonzalez, but Gary Antuanne Russell is looking like a bull in this larger weight class, 140. Again, his brother is fighting at 126. So Gary Antuanne is a bit bigger than Gary Russell Jr., but he's just kind of a patient hunter where he's just kind of tracking you down, and he's throwing jabs, he's throwing hard left hands. He's a southpaw, by the way, so he's throwing the hard left hand to the body, straight lefts to the body, and he started to wear Victor Postal down over time. He was really connecting flush with a lot of those jabs and kind of cornering Victor Postal, then unleashing combinations where Victor Postal, a very technical boxer, was just unable to keep up with the work rate of Gary Antuanne Russell. And then the power became more and more of a factor over the course of the several rounds. So I think that Gary Antuanne has a slightly more aggressive style per round than Gary Russell Jr. Because Gary Russell Jr. did have a lot of aggressive moments, and he was able to fight a lot of fights where he was able to be in full control by the middle rounds, to where he was able to get more aggressive and go for the stoppage like he did against Kiko Martinez, for instance. But Gary Antuanne Russell, again, pretty patient hunter who starts to build the work rate over time. And now he's about to fight Rances Barthelemy, who, was a blue chipper out of Cuba for some time. So he was basically an undefeated fighter throughout several of his early fights. He had built up like a 20-0 record, 20-something 0 record, to where he had become the junior lightweight champion. So that's 130 when he had first fought Argenis Mendez, where he knocked Mendez out of the second round, but then that fight was later ruled a no contest because Barthelemy hit after the bell. So that he had won the IBF title, but then he was stripped of it because the ruling was changed. Then he had a rematch against Argenis Mendez, again for the IBF junior lightweight title, and then he ends up winning, but this time via unanimous decision. So that's how he first secured that 130-pound title, and then he defended it successfully against David Salcedo, beat him via unanimous decision, and then he moved up to lightweight, first fighting Angelo Perez, and then he fought former belt holder Antonio DeMarco. DeMarco had become a lightweight champion, beating Jorge Linares, believe it or not. He had beaten Linares via 11th round TKO back in 2011, defended it successfully a couple times against John Molina Jr., for instance, and then lost that belt to Adrian Broner. So Antonio DeMarco was a big win for Rances Barthelemy at 135. So then he fights Denis Shafikov, and this is again at lightweight, but this is for the vacant IBF lightweight belt. So this was Barthelemy's chance to become a 2-division champion, and then he beats Shafikov via unanimous decision, and then he actually retained that belt against Mickey Bay, beating the very technical, sweet science style Mickey Bay, who fought a super close competitive fight against George Kambosos not too long ago. They're actually still trying to get that fight rescheduled between Tevin Farmer and an aging Mickey Bay. But Rances Barthelemy, by this point, again, has beaten Shafikov, beaten Antonio DeMarco, become a 2-division champion, and then retained the belt against Mickey Bay. So he's looking very good in his career, still undefeated at this point, 25-0. And then he fights Kirill Relik. Kirill Relik, you might remember, is the guy who Regis Prograis beat in the semifinals of the World Boxing Super Series, where Regis Prograis would then fight against Josh Taylor in the finals of that World Boxing Super Series. But just before that, Barthelemy beats Kirill Relik via unanimous decision, and then has a rematch against Kirill Relik for the vacant WBO super lightweight title. So now he's up at 140. So he had relinquished the belt that he had won against Shafikov, defended against Mickey Bay, goes up to 140, beats Kirill Relik, and then loses to Kirill Relik in a rematch for the vacant WBA 140-pound title that was vacated by Terrence Crawford after Crawford became the undisputed champion at 140. So he had basically left 4 belts in his wake, and then one of those belts was up for grab in this rematch between Barthelemy and Kirill Relik, where again, Kirill Relik won in this rematch via unanimous decision, basically outworking Barthelemy. Kirill Relik is a very hard hitter, and he's a pressure fighter. I guess not too dissimilar from Lucas Matisse in certain ways, But Barthelemy, usually a mover, a sticker or mover, who is able to, switch stances, does throw with some pop, but he had won his last several fights via unanimous decision leading into this rematch against Karol Relic. So Karol Relic was the puncher. And again, Rances Barthelemy is now moving up, and here he's fighting for his third divisional title. So Karol Relic ends up working over Rances Barthelemy. He had dropped him in their first fight, ends up beating him in the rematch, again via unanimous decision. And then Barthelemy goes back to 135, wins a fight against Robert Frankel, and then challenges Robert Easter Jr. for the vacant WBA regular lightweight belt, 135 belt. And this ends up being a super close fight, resulting in a split draw between Barthelemy and Robert Easter Jr. Barthelemy is pretty tall for these lighter weight classes. He's about 5'10", but Robert Easter Jr. is even a little bit taller than that. So again, this ends up being a very competitive fight. Barthelemy, usually the sweet science guy, had to do a lot of combination throwing to close the distance between Robert Easter Jr., who's usually pretty good at controlling range. And again, this was anybody's guess going into the judges' scorecards who won this fight. So again, it resulted in a draw. And then Barthelemy, because again, he was fighting for the vacant lightweight belt, trying to become a two-time lightweight champ, not to mention again, a former 130-pound belt holder. And then he goes up again to 140 after like a nearly 2-year layoff between April 2019 when he fought Easter and then returning to the ring after, not fighting at all in the COVID 2020, returns to the ring in January of 2021 against Al Rivera and ends up beating him via unanimous decision. I mean, Barthelemy was in full control. It looked like early, and it looked like he could have gone for an early stoppage because Rivera started off super slow. But like, I remember Sean Porter being super critical of Barthelemy's approach in the middle rounds of this fight, where it seemed like he could pretty much hit Rivera at will, even when he would open up with combinations, just splashing on Rivera, but still unable to get him out of there. So he ends up winning a fight that, ended up going the distance, didn't look like it should have gone the distance, but Barthelemy then fought about 10 months later against Gustavo Vittori, again at 140, but this time Barthelemy actually scores a second round TKO in a scheduled 8-rounder. So Barthelemy had been, trying to call out a lot of the big names when he had gotten to 140 to fight Rivera and then Vittori. He had been calling out Spence up at 147, just wanting to get some elite fighters in the ring with him so then he could become a 3-division champion. So that's what a lot of this path that leads him to Gary Antuanne Russell is about. So Barthelemy, now 36 years old, is fighting again the rising contender at 26 years old, Gary Antuanne Russell. So what do I expect between Gary Antuanne Russell and Rances Barthelemy? Well, again, I was kind of surprised at first when I was looking at the billing, seeing Russell as the A-side fighter. But again, Barthelemy, former 2-division champion, is 36 years old. Hasn't looked great in his last few fights, even though he did score a second-round knockout, but against a much lesser fighter in Gustavo Vittori. Again, had a bit of inactivity after that fight against Robert Easter Jr. So a lot of people, he didn't have a super fan-friendly style to begin with. He relies a lot on movement. So, depending on how you use that movement, you could start collecting a lot of boos. But now that he's 36, he doesn't move as well. So he's kind of forced to getting into several more exchanges because he simply doesn't have the legs that he did in his mid to late 20s and even his early 30s. Like, even when he fought against Karol Relic and against Robert Easter Jr., you would think that his mobility and his energy in the second half of these fights, where he did slow down big time against Al Rivera in his 140-pound, well, his return to 140, because he had done a bit of weight hopping like around the time he had fought, Karol Relic and such. But he slowed down against Karol Relic in the second fight, slowed down, I guess he kind of slowed down against Robert Easter Jr. in their split decision draw, and he, again, slowed down in the second half of the fight against Al Rivera. So I think that he's going to be competitive here in the early rounds against Gary Antuanne Russell. Again, Barthelemy likes to switch stances, and sometimes when he switches to southpaw, he's able to throw this like long wrapping left hand. He could throw it to the body, he could throw it up top. But when he switches from orthodox, where he stays about, I say about 75, 80 something % of the time from the conventional orthodox stance, will switch to southpaw and will throw these like left hand hooks to where a lot of people think that he might be a natural southpaw who's just been fighting most of his career in orthodox. We've seen that from Oscar De La Hoya, and some believe that Miguel Cotto was a natural southpaw who just fought from an orthodox stance so his power hand could become his lead hand. Rances Barthelemy throws a lot of different types of punches. He, again, because he's got the length as well as the height, throws a lot of wide shots because he's able to dictate range and be able to connect with his opponent even if he's out of range for them to hit him. Now, Gary Antuanne Russell is about 5'8" compared to Barthelemy's 5'10". Gary Antuanne Russell, I believe, will be the fighter that's moving forward in this one. And Rances Barthelemy is going to try to stand his ground, but if that doesn't work, he's going to move around enough and then pick his spots to let his hands go in countering Gary Antuanne Russell. Or he might try to move and then just sort of ambush episodically and get combinations off against Russell. But I think Russell is going to be having an effective use of his right jab. And again, look out for his straight left hands, especially to the body. I think he's going to be tapping Barthelemy with the jab early as Barthelemy, again, fights him competitively and closely in these early rounds. But I think that Russell is going to be working the body to where you're going to have a significantly slowed down Barthelemy by the middle rounds, to where I'm kind of wondering, is Gary Antuanne Russell going to be able to continue this knockout streak and become the first to stop Rances Barthelemy? I think Barthelemy is going to start taking a beating as he becomes less mobile into the middle and late rounds. I think he's going to potentially get dropped, but I think that he's got enough veteran savvy to do just enough movement, even when his mobility is compromised from getting beat to the body and hit up top. I think that he's going to be super motivated again to get off to a good start, because he does want to become a 3-division champion, or else he wouldn't still be fighting these, up and coming youngins trying to prove a point to secure a big, highly lucrative fight. That's what Barthelemy's angling for here, because this fight is actually taking place on the undercard of the Danny Garcia versus Jose Benavidez Jr. fight. So Barthelemy is going to want to get a big opportunity, and he'll get that, I believe, if he's able to beat Gary Antuanne Russell. So I think he's going to be looking really good in the early rounds. But again, at 36 years old, I think he's going to show a lot of heart. He's going to show a lot of veteran savvy. I just don't think that you could reinvigorate the legs in the way that you'll need to be able to effectively out-sweet science Gary Antuanne Russell at this stage. So I think that Gary Antuanne Russell's pressure is going to start to pay dividends, as will his work to the body, to where he's going to be threatening, I think, a late stoppage. But I think that the veteranship and the experience of Barthelemy, not to mention his own punches, I think he's going to be landing some significant shots against Russell here. But I think that he's going to hold on to lose via unanimous decision as opposed to getting stopped. I think Gary Antuanne Russell is going to win a clear decision. I'm talking like 118 to 110, maybe 117, 111. I don't think, as well as Barthelemy has fought very good fighters in the past, from Kirill Relic to Robert Easter Jr., I don't think that this is going to be one of those like split draw, split decision wins like he won against Mickey Bay. I think this is going to be a clear, probably the clearest decision loss, versus maybe the Kirill Relic one as well. That was another unanimous decision loss. But I think that this is going to be a competitive in the first half of the fight, but it's going to end up being a clear, like 8 rounds to 4, 9 rounds to 3 style decision win for Gary Antuanne Russell. And that's only going to further boost the name and visibility of Russell. The problem is, if Gary Russell Jr. wins, even if it's via unanimous decision, with the matchmaking and the way that these divisions work these days, it's almost like we almost have to stop looking at these divisions like we look at like the ring top 10, to look at the guys who are available in the division and start hypothetically putting together these dream matches, because if they are not with the same promoter or fighting on the same network, it's almost impossible for the fight to happen. It's only in the rare cases where you could get either like a super fight, where it's like Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, where promoters will work together, Or in some of these cases where you have like a journeyman, say like a Samuel Vargas or somebody, I could see he's able to fight on different networks because he's not as beholden to the promoter. And if they are with the promoter, that promoter for the right price, which isn't a super high price, would give his blessing, would be more willing to give his blessing to let that journeyman go fight on another platform to be the B-side and to have that opportunity to fight a bigger name on another platform or network. But when you have like two good fighters on their respective networks, but they are not superstars to where it's like a bona fide pay-per-view, it just doesn't seem like the cross-promotional effort will be done to get like a Gary Antuanne Russell versus a Jose Zepeda or Jose Ramirez. I mean, we could only hope for maybe like a Russell versus Regis Prograis, who's got a little bit more flexibility in his promotional arrangement, almost like in that Mikey Garcia, the now retired Mikey Garcia stage, where he's with Pro Bellum, but I don't know, his career, I really worry about Regis Prograis' career at this point and his ability to secure big fights. But all that to say, as much as I'd love to see Gary Antuanne Russell fight some of the great fighters at 140, hell, Teofimo Lopez is now at 140, or even Ryan Garcia, if they're not able to make the Ryan Garcia versus Tank Davis fight. Garcia's now wanting to fight almost exclusively at 140. He said he doesn't want to come back down to 135. So Ryan Garcia, he's with DAZN. Golden Boy, though, and then Teofimo Lopez with Top Rank. I just question if Gary Antuanne Russell is able to get past Rances Barthelemy. How do they then have to creatively matchmake to still keep his career in an exciting state where he continues that upward trajectory, continuing to build interest by fighting in the fights that matter? I mean, we've seen when a good fighter is with a network or a promoter who doesn't have a talent-rich division in the division that they fight in, they then have to start like getting very creative in who they match you up with, and it doesn't make for the best fights. We saw with Gervonta Davis, Mario Barrios at 140, Leo Santa Cruz, coming up in a weight where he's not at his best. And, I wonder how Golden Boy's going to handle Virgil Ortiz Jr., who's fighting on DAZN. Like, you have to get creative if you don't have the lion's share of the talent in that division. So I worry about that forecasting Gary Antuanne Russell's career. But in this one, I think he's going to be able to handle business against a two-division former champion, Rances Barthelemy, via unanimous decision. But yeah, let me know what you think about this one. Let me know what you think about Gary Antuanne Russell's skills and apparent ability. I really think that his win over Victor Postal, even though Postal was, again, 38 years old, has kind of flown under the radar a little bit. I think that we should have made more noise over that impressive performance from Russell. But if he follows that up with the win over Barthelemy, yeah, again, his career will definitely be on the right track. We'll just have to keep an eye on the matchmaking there. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.